The last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged treeline, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and deep orange. Foremost in the Silvermane pack, this was a time of buzzing excitement, of hopeful butterflies and nervous laughter. But for Railey the approaching darkness felt heavy, a thick blanket of dread settling over her shoulders. She stood by the small window of her bedroom, her fingers tracing the cool glass as she watched the forest shadows grow long and merge together. Tonight was the mating ceremony, the most important night of the year, and Railey wished she could disappear into those shadows forever. Down below, the common area of the pack grounds was being transformed. Torches were lit, their flames dancing and casting flickering light on the faces of those rushing about. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and sweet berry pies. The air itself was starting to thrum with a low energy, the collective anticipation of dozens of werewolves waiting for the moon to claim the sky. Everyone talked about the magic of the mate bond, the instant you locked eyes with your destined partner and just knew. Railey thought it sounded less like magic and more like a trap. A soft knock came at her door. "Railey? Are you decent?" Her best friend Jenna peeked in without waiting for an answer, her face already glowing with excitement. She held up two simple dresses, one a pale blue, the other a soft yellow. "Which one?" "The blue makes my eyes pop, but the yellow is better for dancing." "Oh, I'm so nervous." "Can you feel it?" "The air is practically buzzing." Railey turned from the window, offering a weak smile. "The yellow is nice," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. She picked up her own dress from her bed, a simple dark green one her mother had insisted on. "Was fine. It was just a dress." Jenna's smile faded as she noticed Railey's expression. "Oh, don't tell me you're still in a mood about this." "It's the ceremony. It's supposed to be wonderful." She dropped the dresses on Railey's bed and came to stand beside her. "Think about it. Tonight you might find your other half. The one the moon goddess chose just for you. Isn't that a beautiful thought?" "It would be," Railey sighed, "if it felt like a choice. It doesn't feel like I'm finding anything, Jenna. Feels like I'm waiting to be claimed. Like a prize. What if I don't want the one the moon goddess chose? What if I want to choose for myself?" She looked at her friend, her eyes pleading for understanding. "What if I want to fall in love slowly, with conversations and shared jokes and knowing someone's heart before I know their scent?" Jenna shook her head, her kind eyes full of pity. "That's not how it works for our kind, Rye. The mate bond is the greatest gift. It's a love deeper than any you could just choose to." She squeezed Railey's arm. "You'll see. Once it happens you'll understand. Now come on, we need to get ready. The moon will be up soon." An hour later, Railey stood at the edge of the roaring celebration. The full moon hung heavy and bright overhead, a brilliant silver coin against the velvety black sky. Its light washed over the clearing, making everything look sharp and dreamlike at the same time. Music from flutes and drums swirled through the air, mixing with the sounds of laughter and dancing. The scent of pine needles, roasted meat, and the unique smell of so many wolves together was overwhelming. She watched as pairs began to form. A young warrior named Ben suddenly stopped his conversation, his head snapping up as if he'd heard a silent call. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a girl from the weaving family, Clara. They walked towards each other as if pulled by an invisible string, and when their hands touched, their smiles were radiant. It was supposed to be beautiful, Railey knew that. But to her it just looked inevitable, like they had no say in the matter. She retreated further, finding a quiet spot near the tall, dark trunks of the ancient pines that encircled the clearing. She leaned against the rough bark, wishing she could sink into it and become invisible. And that's when she saw him. Sitting on an old, moss-covered log, far removed from the firelight and the music, was a man. He was hunched over, his clothes worn and patched in several places. A thick layer of dirt and grime covered his skin, and his hair was long and matted. He was simply watching the ceremony, not with excitement or hope, but with a quiet, deep sadness in his eyes. He looked lonely. This, Railey thought, must be Lucas the pack beggar. The one nobody paid much attention to. In that moment she felt a strange kinship with him. They were both outsiders tonight. Her moment of peace was shattered by a familiar, unpleasant sensation crawling up her spine. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Marcus. She could smell his sharp, aggressive scent before she even saw him. Marcus was a strong, broad-shouldered warrior, arrogant and used to getting what he wanted. And for months he had made it clear that he wanted Railey. She turned her head slightly and saw him cutting through the crowd, his eyes locked directly on her. A confident, possessive smirk was plastered on his face. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. This was it. He was going to claim her right here in front of everyone. The thought of being tied to his brute strength and cruel smiles for the rest of her life made her feel sick. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for any way out. They landed again on the lonely figure of the beggar, Lucas. An idea, wild and desperate and completely crazy, exploded in her mind. It was a terrible idea. It was a scandalous idea. But it was the only idea she had. If she was already touched by someone else, if she had already shared a kiss with another man at the ceremony, maybe Marcus would be disgusted. Maybe the ancient rules would see her as already taken, even if it wasn't a true mate bond. It was a long shot, a gamble with her entire future, but it was better than the certain misery of being with Marcus. Without allowing herself another second to think, without considering the consequences, Railey pushed herself away from the tree. She ignored Jenna's confused call from across the clearing. She didn't even look at Marcus as he got closer. She fixed her gaze on the beggar and started walking, then running, towards him. The world seemed to slow down. The music became a distant hum. The faces of the pack members she passed were a blur of surprise. Lucas, the beggar, looked up as she approached, his sad eyes widening in confusion. He opened his mouth to say something, but Railey didn't give him the chance. She skidded to a stop in front of him. She placed her hands on his shoulders, feeling the coarse fabric of his worn shirt. She saw the shock in his deep brown eyes, saw the grime on his cheeks. She leaned in, closed her own eyes, and pressed her lips firmly against his. The kiss was nothing like the stories. It wasn't soft or magical. It was quick and hard, a collision born of pure fear. His lips were still, surprised, and tasted faintly of the night air and earth. For a single heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then a wave of gasps rippled through the crowd behind her, followed by a dead, ringing silence. The music stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the torches. Railey pulled away, her breath catching in her throat. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of shame and defiant hope. She looked at Lucas. He was staring at her, his expression utterly stunned, as if he'd been struck by lightning. He lifted a hand slowly, his fingers brushing against his own lips where hers had just been. And then, a roar of pure fury shattered the silence. "What have you done?" Railey spun around. Marcus was standing a few feet away, his face twisted in rage, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Every single member of the Silvermane pack was staring at her, their mouths agape. In the sudden, heavy quiet, under the judgmental light of the full moon, Railey realized her plan had worked. She had avoided being claimed by Marcus. But as she stood there, surrounded by a sea of shocked and disapproving faces, with the strange, silent beggar still sitting behind her, she understood one terrifying thing with absolute clarity. She had no idea what she had just started. The silence that followed Railey's kiss was heavier and more profound than any noise the celebration had produced. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the music, the laughter, and even the crackle of the torches. For a long, suspended moment, the entire Silvermane pack was frozen, a painting of shocked faces under the cold, bright eye of the moon. Railey could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, their collective gaze like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her own heartbeat was a frantic, deafening drum in her ears, the only sound she seemed capable of hearing. She stood rooted to the spot, her hand still tingling from where it had rested on the beggar's rough shirt, her lips still holding the faint, earthy memory of the kiss. Marcus was the first to break the spell. His roar had not just been one of anger, it was a sound of pure, unadulterated violation. He took a thunderous step forward, his large body trembling with rage. "You disgraceful little," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that promised violence. His eyes, usually so full of arrogant confidence, were now wild and murderous, fixed solely on Railey. He looked as if he wanted to tear her away from the log and shake her until her bones rattled. But before he could take another step, a firm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Enough, Marcus." The crowd parted as Beta Gareth emerged. He was a tall, stern man with streaks of silver in his dark hair and a face that seemed permanently carved into lines of seriousness. As the pack's second in command, he was the keeper of order, the enforcer of rules. His presence commanded immediate respect and a healthy dose of fear. He walked with a deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the scene, the furious Marcus, the terrified Railey, and the disheveled beggar who still sat on the log, looking as stunned as a man who had just been struck by a falling star. Gareth's gaze settled on Railey. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, profound disappointment that to Railey felt infinitely worse than Marcus's rage. "Railey," he said, his voice calm but icy. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions? The mating ceremony is sacred. It is a tradition handed down through generations, a moment of purity and destiny. You have defiled it with a cheap trick." Railey opened her mouth to speak, to explain her desperation, but no sound came out. What could she possibly say that would justify such a public scandal? Her plan, which had seemed so brilliantly desperate moments ago, now felt like the most foolish, short-sighted act in the world. "It was an insult to the moon goddess," Marcus spat, finding his voice again. "An insult to the pack. She should be exiled. Cast out for her disrespect." A low murmur of agreement rippled through some of the warriors standing behind him. The suggestion of exile sent a cold spike of terror through Railey's heart. To be cast out from the only home she had ever known, to be left alone in the wilds, vulnerable to rogues and other dangers, it was a fate worse than being mated to Marcus. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly very small and very young. It was then that a new voice entered the conversation, quiet and raspy from lack of use, yet it carried a strange, unexpected clarity. "Exile seems a harsh punishment for a kiss." Every head turned towards the beggar Lucas. He had slowly risen to his feet, and though he still looked ragged and dirty, he stood straighter now. His eyes, which had moments ago been wide with shock, now held a thoughtful, almost calculating glint as he looked from Gareth to Railey. Gareth turned to him, his expression unreadable. "The punishment must fit the crime, Lucas. She has shown a lack of respect for our most sacred custom. What would you suggest?" Lucas was silent for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Railey. She saw him taking in her frightened posture, her wide, pleading eyes. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "The girl acted out of fear, not malice," he said finally, his voice gaining a subtle strength. "She sought to avoid a fate she did not want. A month ago my roof sprang a leak. The west wall of my cabin lets in a draft that chills the whole place. The garden is overrun with weeds." The pack listened, confused. What did his household chores have to do with anything? Lucas continued, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "It seems to me that the girl lacks an appreciation for the simple, honest work that keeps a pack strong. She focused on the spectacle of the ceremony, not its true meaning. So, I propose her punishment be one of reflection and labor." He looked directly at Gareth. "Let her be given into my care for one full cycle of the moon. She will live at my cabin. She will repair the roof, she will patch the wall, she will tend the garden. She will cook and clean and learn the value of a hard day's work. She will learn humility." A fresh wave of whispers swept through the crowd. The idea was bizarre, unheard of. A young, unmated woman sent to live with a pack beggar? It was almost as scandalous as the kiss itself. Marcus scoffed loudly. "This is absurd. She should be." "It is a fair judgment," Gareth interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards Lucas, a gesture that held a meaning Railey could not decipher. "The crime was an act of disrespect towards the spirit of the ceremony. The punishment will be a lesson in respect for the foundations of pack life. Railey will go with Lucas. For 1 month she will be in his charge. Her actions will reflect upon him, and his guidance will shape her correction." The beta's word was law. The decision was made. Railey felt a dizzying whirl of emotions. She had avoided exile. She had avoided Marcus. But she was now condemned to a month of servitude to a man she did not know, a silent, grimy outcast. Was this really a better fate? Without another word, Gareth gestured for 2 nearby pack members to escort Railey. There would be no goodbyes, no chance to pack a proper bag or speak with Jenna. The punishment was to begin immediately, a lesson in the swift, uncompromising nature of pack justice. The walk to the edge of the pack lands was a blur of shame and confusion. The crowd's stares felt like physical pricks on her skin. She caught a final glimpse of Jenna's horrified face and Marcus's smug, satisfied smirk. He might not have gotten her, but he clearly thought she'd gotten what she deserved. Lucas walked a few paces ahead, not looking back. His cabin was nestled in a particularly dense and neglected part of the territory, a good distance from the main cluster of homes. When they finally reached it, Railey saw that his description had been generous. The small wooden structure leaned slightly to one side. The roof was indeed patched with mismatched bits of wood and moss. The single window was grimy, and the small plot of land that was supposed to be a garden was a tangled mess of thorns and wild plants. The escorts left them at the door with stern warnings to Railey about obeying the terms of her punishment. As their footsteps faded away, Railey was left alone with the silent beggar in the deepening night. The sounds of the distant celebration were gone, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the lonely hoot of an owl. Lucas pushed the creaky wooden door open and gestured for her to enter. The inside was just as bleak as the outside. A cold fireplace sat on one wall, a rough-hewn table and a single chair stood in the middle of the room, and a narrow cot was tucked into a corner. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke and something unidentifiably lonely. He turned to her, his face shadowed in the dim light. His earlier thoughtful expression was gone, replaced by a mask of quiet detachment. "You will sleep on the floor by the fire," he said, his voice flat. "Tomorrow at first light you will begin. You will clean this cabin. You will cook the food that is in the pantry. You will learn what it means to have responsibilities that are not about party dresses and avoiding suitors." Railey's pride, which had been bruised and battered all evening, finally flared. "You can't just order me around like a servant," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Lucas looked at her, and for a second she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not anger but a deep, ancient weariness. "For the next month, Railey," he said softly, "that is exactly what I can do. This is your punishment. And perhaps, if you are lucky, it will also be your education." He pointed to a pile of old blankets in the corner. "Those are for you. The stream for water is behind the house. Do not try to run away. The forests at night are not kind to spoiled pack girls." With that, he turned his back on her and walked to the narrow cot, lying down without another word. Railey stood in the middle of the dark, dirty cabin, hugging herself. The full moon's light streamed through the dirty window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She was alone, more alone than she had ever been in her life. She had gotten exactly what she thought she wanted, an escape from the ceremony. But as she looked around the grim little room at the man who was now her keeper, she wondered if in her desperation to avoid one cage, she had simply thrown herself into another. The first light of dawn did not so much stream into the cabin as it seeped, a pale, grayish glow that revealed the full extent of the dirt and disrepair in harsh, unforgiving detail. Railey had not slept. She had spent the long, cold night on the hard-packed earth floor, wrapped in the thin, scratchy blankets that smelled of dust and old leaves. Every rustle in the forest outside, every creak of the old cabin settling, had jolted her awake, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, anger, and a profound, homesick sadness. When Lucas rose from his cot just as the sky began to lighten, she was already awake, her body stiff and her spirit bruised. He moved around the small space with a quiet, practiced efficiency, barely glancing at her. He didn't speak. He simply went to the hearth, laid a new fire with a few pieces of precious dry wood, and struck a flint until a small, weak flame sputtered to life. The meager heat it offered was a small comfort against the morning chill. Then he placed a dented metal pot of water from a bucket by the door onto the fire to heat. From a nearly empty pantry, he took a small sack of oats and measured a tiny portion into 2 wooden bowls. Only when the water was hot and the oats were poured did he finally acknowledge her. "The water is for washing," he said, his voice a low rumble that fit the quiet of the dawn. He nodded toward a cleanish-looking cloth hanging on a nail. "The oats are for eating. After that you will begin." Railey wanted to refuse. Her pride screamed at her to push the bowl away, to demand to be taken back to her parents, to something familiar. But the pragmatic part of her, the part that had survived the long night, knew that hunger and dirt were poor allies in a battle of wills. Silently she took the bowl of bland, lukewarm porridge. It was the most plain food she had ever eaten, but it was filling. She washed her face and hands with the warm water, the simple act feeling like a small reclaiming of her own dignity. Her first task, as Lucas outlined with no-nonsense brevity, was to sweep the entire cabin. It sounded simple enough. But as she took the worn-out broom made of twigs, she quickly realized the enormity of the job. Years of dirt and debris had accumulated in the corners, mixed with dried leaves that had blown in under the ill-fitting door. Dust rose in great clouds with every stroke of the broom, making her cough and her eyes water. Lucas sat at the small table, sharpening a hunting knife with a slow, rhythmic scrape of stone on metal, watching her without comment. At first, Railey worked with angry, jerky movements fueled by resentment. But anger was a fuel that burned out quickly. After an hour, her arms ached, and the floor only looked marginally cleaner. She slowed down, learning to use the broom more effectively, to push the dirt into a pile instead of just redistributing it around the room. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but a strange thing began to happen. As she focused on the simple physical rhythm of sweeping, the storm of emotions in her head began to quiet. There was no room for panic about the future or anger about the past when all her concentration was required to conquer a pile of dirt. Lucas eventually stood and went outside without a word, leaving her to her work. When she finally finished sweeping, she felt a small, surprising flicker of accomplishment. The floor was clean. It was a tangible result. She had done that. This pattern continued for days. Lucas would assign her a task, scrubbing the grime from the single window until it sparkled, beating the dust from his few blankets outside, sorting through the meager pantry supplies. He was never cruel, but he was relentlessly demanding. He expected the work to be done and done well. He spoke little, offering only brief instructions or corrections. He spent much of his time outside, tending to a few snares he had set for rabbits or gathering edible plants from the forest, always returning at mealtimes. The silence between them was a living thing. At first, it was heavy and uncomfortable, filled with Railey's unspoken resentment. But as the days turned into a week, the silence began to change. It became less about anger and more about a shared, quiet existence. They ate their simple meals together at the small table. Stews made from rabbit and wild onions, flatbreads Railey learned to cook over the fire. The work was hard, but it was honest. Her body, which had been soft from a life of relative ease, grew stronger. Her hands, once smooth, developed calluses. The first real crack in the wall between them came on a rainy afternoon. Railey was attempting to patch the drafty west wall with a mixture of mud and straw, a task Lucas had shown her with surprising patience. The mud was cold and slimy and she was struggling to make it stick. Frustrated, she pushed too hard, and a sharp piece of the wicker lining the wall sliced deep into her palm. A sharp cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. Blood welled up instantly, bright red against the gray mud. She clutched her hand, tears of pain and frustration springing to her eyes. Lucas, who had been mending a fishing net in the corner, was at her side in an instant. He didn't speak. Gently but firmly, he took her injured hand in his. His own hands, she noticed, were large and strong, the skin rough and scarred, but his touch was unexpectedly careful. He led her to the table, sat her down, and fetched a clean cloth and a small clay jar of salve from a shelf. He cleaned the cut with water from the bucket, his movements sure and steady. The pain began to recede, replaced by a strange, warm tingling where his fingers held her wrist. Railey watched his face. In the soft, gray light of the rainy day, she saw the lines around his eyes, the quiet intensity of his focus. This was not the face of a simple, broken beggar. There was a depth there, a history she couldn't begin to guess at. He applied the salve, a pungent mix of herbs and wax, and wrapped her hand neatly with the cloth. "It's deep, but it will heal," he said, his voice low. His brown eyes met hers, and for the first time she didn't see judgment or detachment. She saw a flicker of concern. "You are learning. That is what matters." That small act of kindness, the first he had shown her since her arrival, changed everything. The wall of silence crumbled that evening. The rain continued to patter softly on the roof, a cozy sound now that the drafty wall was partially sealed. They sat by the fire after their meal, the warmth a comforting presence. "Why did you do it?" Lucas asked quietly, staring into the flames. "The kiss." The question hung in the air. Railey hesitated, then the whole story came tumbling out. She spoke of her fear of the ceremony, her dread of being a prize to be won, her specific terror of Marcus and his possessive nature. She told him about wanting to choose her own path, to fall in love slowly. She apologized sincerely this time for using him as her escape route. "It was a terrible thing to do," she finished, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just so scared." Lucas was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackling fire. "Fear is a powerful master," he said finally. He didn't look at her, but his profile was thoughtful in the firelight. "It makes us do things we regret. But it can also lead us to places we need to be." He glanced around the small but now clean and orderly cabin. Not all cages have visible bars. Sometimes the expectations of others can be the most confining prison of all. His words resonated deep within her. He understood. He truly understood. "And you?" she dared to ask. "Why are you out here? All alone?" A shadow passed over his face. "I am looking for something," he said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Or perhaps I am waiting to see if something can find me. It is complicated." They lapsed back into silence, but this time it was comfortable, a shared space between two people who were no longer strangers. The air between them felt different, charged with a new understanding. Railey felt a pull towards him, a curiosity that was more than just gratitude. She saw the strength in his quiet demeanor, the kindness beneath the gruff exterior. Later, as she prepared her bed for the night, he came to stand beside her. "The floor is too hard for so many nights," he said. "I will take it tonight. You take the cot." It was a simple offer, but it felt monumental. "I can't," she started to protest. "Railey," he said, and the way he said her name, with a softness she hadn't heard before, made her heart skip a beat. "Please." She nodded, a flush warming her cheeks. As she moved to the cot, he stood close to her. The space between them seemed to shrink, filled with the warmth of the fire and the unspoken things hanging in the air. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. It was nothing like the frantic, desperate kiss she had forced upon him. This time when he leaned in, she met him halfway. Their second kiss was slow, tender, and full of a questioning wonder. It was an exploration, a gentle tasting. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers. It held none of the panic of the first, but all of the promise of something new, something real beginning to bloom in the most unexpected of places. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, the world outside the cabin, with all its rules and ceremonies, felt a million miles away. Here, in this small, quiet space, something true had been found. The days that followed the kiss were transformed, as if the entire cabin and the forest surrounding it had been dipped in gold. The air, once heavy with silence, now hummed with unspoken words and shared glances. The hard work remained, but it was no longer a punishment. It was a rhythm they fell into together. Railey would patch the roof, and Lucas would steady the ladder, his hands firm on her waist, a touch that now sent a thrill through her instead of a shiver of fear. They would work in the garden, clearing the weeds side by side, their shoulders brushing, their laughter echoing in the quiet clearing. The simple meals they shared at the small table felt like feasts, filled with easy conversation and long looks that spoke volumes. Railey found herself studying him, learning the new language of his expressions. She saw the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was genuinely amused, a rare and beautiful sight. She learned that his quietness wasn't emptiness, but a deep, thoughtful reserve. He began to share small pieces of himself, stories of traveling through the northern forests, of seeing a sky filled with dancing lights, of the different ways packs lived beyond their own territory. They were still just fragments, carefully chosen tales that avoided any mention of his past or his family, but to Railey they were treasures. She felt she was being allowed to see the real man beneath the beggar's disguise, and with every revelation, her feelings for him grew deeper and more certain. This, she thought with a heart full of wonder, was what she had always wanted. This slow, gentle falling, this knowing of a person's soul. One afternoon, they were returning from the stream, carrying buckets of fresh water. The sun was warm on their backs, and Railey was telling Lucas about a dream she'd had, something silly about flying over the pack lands. He was listening, a soft smile on his face, when he suddenly stopped walking. His entire body went rigid. The smile vanished, replaced by an expression of sharp alertness. His head tilted, as if listening to a sound she couldn't hear. "Railey," he said, his voice low and urgent, all traces of softness gone. "Get inside the cabin. Now." "What? Why?" she asked, confused by the sudden change. "Now," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed instantly. A cold dread, forgotten during the warm days, trickled down her spine. She hurried into the cabin, setting her bucket down with a slosh. Lucas followed, closing the door firmly behind them. He didn't bolt it though. He simply stood in the middle of the room, his back to her, waiting. The cozy safety of the cabin suddenly felt thin and fragile. Minutes stretched by, filled with a tense silence. Then they heard it, the crunch of heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching through the dry leaves outside. A shadow fell across the dirty window. The door was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the inner wall. Marcus stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. His face was a mask of bitter jealousy and rage. He had clearly been drinking. His eyes were bloodshot, and he swayed slightly on his feet. He ignored Lucas completely, his hateful gaze fixed on Railey. "Did you really think you could hide out here with this garbage?" Marcus slurred, taking a menacing step into the cabin. "Playing house. You humiliated me. You belong to me, Railey. Everyone knows it. This little vacation is over. You're coming with me." Railey's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus." "You don't have a choice," he roared and lunged for her. But before his hands could touch her, Lucas moved. It was a blur of motion, so fast Railey's eyes could barely track it. He stepped between her and Marcus, his posture no longer that of a hunched, weary beggar. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Touch her," Lucas said, his voice dangerously calm, "and you will regret it." Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He looked Lucas up and down with utter contempt. "Or what, old man? You'll throw your porridge at me? Get out of my way before I break you in half." Lucas didn't flinch. "Leave. This is your only warning." Enraged by the defiance, Marcus swung a heavy fist aimed directly at Lucas's head. It was a blow that would have knocked any ordinary man unconscious. But Lucas was not an ordinary man. He didn't just dodge the blow. He caught Marcus's fist in his own hand, stopping it dead with an effortless, crushing grip. Marcus's eyes widened in shock and pain. Lucas held him there, immobile, and then, with a simple, powerful twist of his wrist, he forced Marcus to his knees. "What?" Marcus grunted, struggling uselessly. Then the change began. It wasn't a full shift into wolf form, but a partial, terrifying transformation that revealed true power. Lucas seemed to grow even taller. The air around him crackled with energy, a pressure that made the hairs on Railey's arms stand up. His eyes, usually a deep, warm brown, began to glow with an unearthly, brilliant gold light, the unmistakable sign of an alpha. The power radiating from him was so immense, so absolute, that it filled the small cabin, making the very walls seem to vibrate. "Kneel," Lucas commanded, and his voice was no longer that of the quiet beggar. It was the voice of a king, deep and resonant, layered with the power of his wolf. Marcus, his face a picture of sheer, pants-wetting terror, could do nothing else. He trembled violently under Lucas's grip, all his drunken bravado evaporated. Lucas released him with a shove. "You will return to the pack. You will speak of this to no one. If you ever come near Railey again, if you ever even look in her direction the next time we meet, it will be for your final judgment. Do you understand?" Marcus could only nod, scrambling backward on his hands and knees before stumbling to his feet and fleeing into the forest without a backward glance. The golden light faded from Lucas's eyes, and the overwhelming pressure in the room subsided. He turned slowly to face Railey. The truth was written in the set of his shoulders, in the residual power that still clung to him like a cloak. Railey stood frozen, her mind reeling, trying to reconcile the man she had fallen in love with the impossible reality standing before her. The gentle hands that had tended her wound, the man who had shared quiet stories by the fire. He was a king. The Alpha King. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you?" He took a deep breath, his expression pained. "My name is Lucas," he said softly. "But I am not a beggar. I am the Alpha of the Crimson Peak Pack. The one they call the King." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Railey felt the ground fall away beneath her. Crimson Peak was the most powerful legendary pack in all the territories. Their alpha was a figure from stories, a distant, almost mythical ruler. You lied to me," she said, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. "All of it? Everything these past weeks? Was it all a game? Was this just some amusement for you? To live like a peasant and toy with the feelings of a silly pack girl?" "Railey, no," he said, taking a step toward her, his hand outstretched. "It was the only way. I'm so tired of people seeing only a crown. I wanted someone to see me. Just Lucas. The man. You saw me. You kissed a beggar to avoid a fate you didn't want. You were the first person in a very long time who looked at me and didn't see a title. But the hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. The beautiful, fragile trust they had built shattered into 1,000 pieces. You let me believe you were nothing," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You let me clean your cabin, cook your food, feel sorry for you. You let me fall in love with a lie. Everything we talked about, everything I shared with you, it was all based on a trick. Everything I felt for you was real," he pleaded, his own eyes full of anguish. "It is the most real thing I have ever known." "Was my punishment real?" she shot back, her voice cracking. "Or was that just part of the game too? Did you and Beta Gareth have a good laugh about it? The foolish girl who fell for the king in disguise." She couldn't bear to look at him another second. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a prison of lies. With a sob tearing from her chest, she turned and ran. She shoved past him, out the door, and fled into the deep, darkening woods, not caring about the dangers, needing only to get away from the devastating truth. The man she loved was a phantom, and the king who remained was a stranger who had broken her heart. The forest was a blur of tearing branches and shadows as Railey ran. She didn't have a destination. Her only thought was to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cabin, between herself and the shattering truth. The gentle, familiar woods that had surrounded her home all her life now felt alien and menacing. Thorns snagged on her dress, scratching her arms, but she barely felt the sting. The pain in her heart was too overwhelming, a raw, gaping wound where something beautiful had just been torn away. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the dirt and sweat, and sobs racked her body, making it hard to breathe. How could she have been so stupid? How could she have believed that a quiet, simple life with a kind outcast was possible? It had all been a lie, a cruel performance for a king bored with his own privilege. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave way, collapsing at the base of a giant, ancient oak tree. She curled into a ball against its massive roots, the rough bark digging into her back, and let the grief consume her. The memory of his touch, his smiles, their conversations by the fire, every cherished moment was now poisoned. Had he been laughing at her the entire time? Judging her clumsy attempts at cooking and cleaning? The humiliation was as acute as the heartbreak. She had given him her trust, her vulnerability, and he had built it all on a foundation of deception. The Alpha King. The words echoed in her mind, each time feeling like a fresh slap. He was untouchable, a ruler from a different world, and she was just a girl from a small pack who had been naive enough to believe in a fairy tale. Back at the cabin, Lucas stood alone in the silence she had left behind. The emptiness was deafening. He looked around at the clean floor she had swept, the patched wall she had mended, the hearth where they had shared their meals. Her absence was a physical ache in his chest, more painful than any battle wound. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had found someone who saw the man behind the crown. But in his fear of scaring her away with his title, he had destroyed the very thing he wanted to protect. Her tears, her accusations, echoed in his ears. He had not been a king playing a game. He had been a man desperately trying to find a real connection. But from her perspective, the difference was meaningless. The truth had been withheld and the trust was broken. For 2 days Railey wandered the forest, surviving on berries and stream water, her spirit as lost as her body. She avoided the main pack trails, not ready to face the questions and the pity. On the morning of the 3rd day, as she sat by a small creek, a young pack scout she knew slightly found her. He did not try to bring her back. Instead, he handed her a single folded piece of parchment, sealed with a drop of wax but no royal insignia. "Beta Gareth said to give this to you if I found you," the scout said quietly before melting back into the trees. With trembling hands, Railey broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was strong and clear, yet careful, as if each word had been chosen with immense thought. "Railey, I will not make excuses. My deception was a betrayal of your trust, and for that I am deeply and truly sorry. I came to your pack as a beggar because my life as a king had become a cage. Every smile was given because of my title, every kindness offered in hope of a reward. I was lonely in a crowd of people. Then a brave and desperate girl kissed a beggar to save herself. You saw a person who was overlooked and alone, and you acted with a courage I have rarely seen. In the weeks that followed, you saw only Lucas. You showed me kindness without wanting anything in return. You shared your dreams and your fears with a simple man. The feelings that grew between us were not part of a plan. They were the most genuine thing I have ever experienced. You taught me the value of the life I had been pretending to live. The roof you fixed no longer leaks. The wall you patched keeps out the cold. The garden you planted is starting to grow. You didn't just clean a cabin. You built a home. I am returning to Crimson Peak today. The pack needs its king. But I wanted you to know that the man you met in that cabin is the real man. My title is an accident of birth. The person I am with you is my choice. I will not command you. I will not force you. The choice must be yours, freely given. If your heart can find a way to forgive me, meet me at the clearing where we first met at sunset. If you do not come, I will understand and I will never trouble you again. But know that wherever I am, my heart remains with you. Yours, Lucas." Railey read the letter once, then again, and a 3rd time. The anger and hurt were still there, a heavy knot in her stomach. But as she read his words, she began to see the other side of the story. She remembered the deep sadness in his eyes that first night, the weariness he carried. She thought of the way he had listened to her, the respect he had shown for her thoughts, even when she was his prisoner. He had not been cruel or mocking. He had been hiding. Just as she had been hiding from the ceremony, he had been hiding from his crown. The hours until sunset passed with agonizing slowness. She wrestled with her doubts and her fears. Could she trust him again? Was she brave enough to step into a world of kings and queens? But a stronger voice, the one that had grown during her time at the cabin, asked a different question. Could she really walk away from the man she had fallen in love with? As the sun began to dip below the trees, painting the sky in fiery hues, Railey found herself walking toward the ceremonial clearing. Her heart was pounding, not with panic this time, but with a nervous, hopeful anticipation. The clearing was empty when she arrived, the memories of that frantic night flooding back. But then she saw him. He was not dressed as a beggar. He wore simple, dark, well-made clothes fit for travel but not for a throne. He stood in the center of the clearing, waiting. He was every inch the king she now knew him to be, his posture proud, his presence commanding. But when his eyes found hers, they were the same warm, gentle eyes of the man who had tended her hand. The entire Silvermane pack began to gather at the edges of the clearing, drawn by the unspoken tension in the air. Beta Gareth was there, his expression solemn. Jenna watched with wide, hopeful eyes. Even Marcus was present, standing far back, his head bowed in submission. Lucas waited until Railey stopped a few feet from him. He did not approach her. He simply looked at her, his love and his fear of her answer plain on his face. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, the Alpha King, the most powerful werewolf in the territories, went down on one knee before her. The crowd gasped. "Railey," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying through the silent clearing. "I asked you here not to command you but to ask you. You once chose a beggar in a moment of defiance. Now I am asking you to choose the man he was, and the king I am, in a moment of clarity. I love you. Not because a moon told me to but because of your strength, your kindness and your spirit. Will you choose me? Will you leave the life you know and come with me? Will you be my partner, my equal, my Luna and my queen?" The world seemed to hold its breath. Railey looked at the man kneeling before her, offering not a command but a question. He was giving her the one thing she had always wanted. A choice. He was risking his own heart, his entire kingdom's future, on her answer. She saw the truth in his eyes, the same truth she had seen in the cabin. The title had been the lie, the man had always been real. A slow, sure smile spread across her face, wiping away the last traces of doubt. She stepped forward and placed her hand in his. "I choose you, Lucas," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Not as a king but as the man I fell in love with. I will go with you." A radiant joy transformed Lucas's face. He stood, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the first two. It was not born of panic or gentle discovery. It was a kiss of promise, of a future chosen together, a sealing of a bond that was stronger than tradition or title. It was a kiss of true equal love. As the pack erupted into cheers, their future together began. They would rule side by side, a king and queen who had learned that the greatest power was not in a crown, but in the courage to be vulnerable and the strength to choose love. If you enjoyed following Railey and Lucas's journey from a desperate kiss to a chosen love, there are many more stories like theirs waiting to be discovered. To make sure you never miss a new adventure, be sure to subscribe to the channel. A simple click helps bring more of these tales to life. Thank you for reading.